The knock at midnight. The wind moved like a restless spirit across Ethan Cole's ranch, dragging thin trails of dust along the dry earth. Night had settled deep and heavy, pressing against the wooden walls of his house as if testing their strength. Inside, everything was still. A single oil lamp burned on the table, its flame trembling in the quiet, much like the man who sat beside it. Ethan had long grown accustomed to silence. It had become his companion in the years since Clara's passing, a quiet that did not soothe, but endured. He filled his days with labor and his nights with routine, careful not to disturb the fragile balance that kept memory from overwhelming him. Yet even in this controlled stillness, loneliness lingered, patient and unyielding. Then came the knock. It was not loud nor forceful, but it cut through the night with unnatural urgency. Ethan stiffened, his gaze shifting toward the door. No one came out this far after dark, not unless something had gone terribly wrong. The knock came again, quicker this time. Ethan rose, every movement deliberate, and crossed the room. When he opened the door, the cold night air rushed in, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and fear. Standing at the threshold was a small girl, no older than 8, her dark hair clinging to her damp face. Her eyes, wide and glistening, searched his as though he were the last answer she had left. "Mama," she said, her voice trembling. "Mama is birthing a baby." For a moment, Ethan did not move. The words stirred something deep within him, an echo of a night he had spent years trying to forget. A different voice, a different plea, but the same helpless urgency. His chest tightened, memories pressing at the edges of his restraint. "Where?" he asked quietly. The girl pointed into the darkness, toward a distant cluster of dim shapes barely visible beyond the fields. Ethan nodded once. There was no time to hesitate. He reached for the lanterns, one, then another, lighting each with steady hands despite the unease building inside him. The warm glow filled the room, pushing back the shadows, though not the memories. He grabbed his coat and stepped outside, closing the door behind him without looking back. "Lead the way," he said. The girl moved quickly, her small figure darting through the night as Ethan followed, the lanterns casting long, wavering shadows across the ground. The path was uneven, the air sharp, but neither of them spoke. There was only the sound of hurried footsteps and the quiet hum of the wind. As they approached the modest house, Ethan could hear it, a strained, broken rhythm of breathing from within. Pain, fear, alone. The girl pushed the door open without hesitation, and Ethan stepped inside. The room was dim, lit only by a dying candle. On a narrow bed lay a woman, her face pale with exhaustion, strands of dark hair clinging to her skin. Her hands gripped the thin blanket as another wave of pain overtook her. She turned her head slightly, her eyes meeting Ethan's with a mixture of surprise and desperation. She began, but her voice faltered. "It's all right," Ethan said, though he was not certain it was. "I'm here to help." He set the lanterns around the room, one by one, until the space was filled with steady light. The shadows retreated, revealing the full weight of the moment. The woman's struggle, the child's fear, and his own unspoken doubt. "I'm Maylin," she managed between breaths. Ethan nodded. Ethan Cole. There was no time for more. He moved with quiet efficiency, guided by instinct more than knowledge. He had no training for this, no preparation, only the memory of what he had once failed to do. But this time, he refused to stand helpless. "Breathe steady," he told her, his voice calm despite the storm within him. "You're not alone." The hours blurred into a fragile sequence of effort and endurance. Maylin fought through each wave of pain with quiet strength, her determination unbroken even as exhaustion threatened to overtake her. The girl, Lily, stayed close, her small hand gripping the edge of the bed as if anchoring herself to hope. And then, at last, the tension broke. A cry filled the room, sharp, new, alive. Ethan exhaled, a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The sound cut through the weight of the night, replacing fear with something lighter, something unfamiliar. Relief. Maylin sank back against the pillow, her eyes closing briefly before opening again, softer now. Ethan placed the child gently beside her, watching as she reached out with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered. Ethan stepped back, the lantern light flickering across his face. For a moment, he said nothing. The room felt different now, warmer, fuller, as though something had shifted beyond the obvious. "It'll be all right," he said quietly. But as he turned toward the door, he knew the truth was more complicated than that. Outside, dawn had begun its slow rise, the first hints of light stretching across the horizon. Ethan paused, glancing back once at the house, its windows glowing softly against the fading dark. He had brought light into that place. Yet as he walked away, the shadows within him stirred once more, no longer quiet, no longer distant. Something had changed, and this time, he wasn't sure he could return to the silence he once knew. A dangerous warmth. Morning settled gently over the ranch, but Ethan Cole felt none of its calm. The memory of the night lingered with an unusual persistence, threading through his thoughts as he worked. He moved through his routine with practiced precision, feeding the horses, repairing a broken fence, checking the water lines. But each task felt slightly displaced, as though his mind had shifted elsewhere while his body remained behind. He told himself it had been nothing more than necessity. A child had come for help, and he had answered. That was all. Yet the echo of Mei Lin's voice, soft with exhaustion and gratitude, refused to fade. Nor did the image of the lantern-lit room, where something fragile had been brought safely into the world. By midday, the silence of the ranch began to feel heavier than usual. Ethan set his tools aside, wiping the dust from his hands as he stared toward the distant edge of the fields. He did not deliberate long. The decision came quietly, almost without permission. He would check on them. The walk felt shorter in daylight, the path clearer, though no less uncertain. When he reached the small house, he paused briefly before knocking. This time, the door opened without hesitation. Lily stood there, her expression no longer gripped by fear, but softened by recognition. "You came back," she said simply. Ethan nodded. "Just to see how your mother's doing." She stepped aside, allowing him in. Inside, the room carried a different atmosphere. Calmer, though still marked by exhaustion. Maylin sat upright now, the newborn cradled carefully in her arms. Her face bore the traces of fatigue, yet there was a quiet strength in her posture, a resilience that had not been evident in the chaos of the night before. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself," she said, though her tone carried no real protest. "It's no trouble," Ethan replied. "How are you holding up?" She glanced down at the child, her expression softening. "We're managing." Ethan inclined his head, his gaze briefly lingering on the baby before shifting back to her. There was a pause, brief, but weighted, before he spoke again. "Do you have what you need? Food, water, help?" Mei Lin hesitated, just long enough to reveal the truth beneath her composed exterior. "Enough," she said, though the word lacked certainty. Ethan understood the difference between sufficiency and honesty. Without pressing further, he stepped outside, returning moments later with a small bundle, bread, dried meat, and a canteen. "You can return it when you're able," he said, setting it on the table. Her eyes met his, a flicker of something unspoken passing between them. "Thank you," she said quietly. The simplicity of the moment carried an unexpected weight. Over the following days, Ethan found reasons, practical, reasonable ones, to return. A loose hinge on the door, a leaking roof, a fence that needed mending. Each visit was brief, purposeful, and yet increasingly difficult to define as mere obligation. With each passing conversation, the space between them shifted. He learned that Mei Lin had come from far away, following a life that had promised stability but delivered something far less certain. Her husband, Daniel, worked frequently in distant towns, leaving her to manage the home alone for long stretches. His absence was not unusual, she explained, but it had grown longer over time. Ethan did not ask more than she offered, but he noticed the way her voice changed when she spoke of him. Careful, restrained, as though certain truths were better left unspoken. One afternoon, as Ethan repaired a section of fencing near the house, Mei Lin stood nearby, watching in thoughtful silence. The child rested inside, and Lily played quietly at a distance. "You're used to doing everything yourself," Mei Lin observed. Ethan glanced up briefly. "It's simpler that way." She considered this. Simpler doesn't always mean easier. He returned his focus to the task, though her words lingered. "Sometimes it does," he said. But even as he spoke, he knew it was no longer entirely true. As the days unfolded, a quiet familiarity took root. Their conversations grew less guarded, shaped by shared understanding rather than necessity. They spoke of small things, the weather, the land, the rhythm of work, but beneath it all ran a current of something deeper, something neither of them acknowledged directly. It revealed itself in the pauses, in the way Mei Lin would hold his gaze a moment longer than required, or how Ethan found himself noticing details he would have once ignored, the steadiness of her voice, the quiet determination in her movements. The absence of Daniel became more pronounced with each passing day. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in muted gold, Ethan prepared to leave as he always did. Mei Lin walked with him to the door, the child asleep in the next room. "You don't have to keep coming," she said, though her voice carried a trace of hesitation. Ethan met her eyes. "I know." The air between them stilled. For a moment, neither spoke. The distance that had once defined their interactions felt uncertain now, as though it could be crossed with a single step. Mei Lin's hand rested lightly against the doorframe, close enough that Ethan became aware of it without meaning to. The space between them narrowed, not by movement, but by awareness. Then, as quickly as it formed, the moment shifted. Ethan stepped back. "You should rest," he said, his voice steady, though quieter than before. She nodded, though her expression held something unresolved. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night." He turned and walked away, the fading light stretching his shadow across the ground. Behind him, the door closed softly, but the echo of that unspoken moment remained. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the weight of something more than memory. And as the darkness returned, he understood with unsettling clarity that the boundary he had lived by was no longer as firm as he once believed. Something had begun, and neither of them had yet decided where it would end. The line between light and shadow. The sky had been threatening rain since early afternoon, but by nightfall, the storm finally broke. Wind pressed hard against the plains, bending the dry grass in restless waves, while distant thunder rolled like a warning too long ignored. Ethan Cole stood by his window, watching the first streaks of rain cut through the dust. The lantern on his table flickered, its unsteady glow pulling his gaze back inside, back to the quiet he had once relied on. But the quiet no longer held. For days, he had kept his distance. The visits had stopped, not because the need had vanished, but because it had grown too difficult to deny. Every moment spent near Mei Lin had begun to carry a weight he could neither justify nor escape. He had drawn the line himself, and yet, standing alone now, he found that distance had offered no relief. If anything, it had sharpened the absence. Another crack of thunder split the sky, closer this time. Ethan exhaled slowly, as though steadying himself against something unseen. He told himself to stay, to let the storm pass, both outside and within. But when he reached for the lantern, the decision had already been made. The path to Mei Lin's house was darker than he remembered, the storm swallowing what little light the moon had offered. Rain soaked through his coat, the wind pushing against him with stubborn force, but he did not turn back. By the time he reached the door, his pulse had settled into a quiet certainty he did not question. He knocked once. The door opened almost immediately, as though she had been expecting something. If not him, then perhaps the moment itself. Mei Lin stood there, her expression shifting from surprise to something softer, something more complicated. The faint light behind her traced the outline of her figure, casting long shadows that seemed to blur the space between them. "You shouldn't be out in this," she said, though her voice lacked insistence. "Neither should you," Ethan replied. For a moment, neither moved. Then she stepped aside, and he entered. The house felt smaller than before, the air warmer, charged by the storm pressing in from all sides. The baby slept in the next room, undisturbed by the restless night, while Lily lay curled beneath a blanket, her breathing steady and deep. Ethan set the lantern down, its glow expanding slowly, filling the space between them. "I didn't come for any reason I can explain," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Mei Lin closed the door, her hand lingering on the wood for a moment before she turned back to him. "Then don't explain it." The simplicity of her response settled heavily in the room. They stood facing one another, the distance between them no longer defined by obligation or circumstance, but by choice. The storm outside grew louder, rain striking the roof in a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the tension within. "You've been avoiding this," she said after a moment. Ethan did not pretend to misunderstand. "I've been trying to." "And has it worked?" He met her gaze, and for once, he did not look away. "No." The honesty in his voice shifted something between them, stripping away the last of the restraint that had kept them at a distance. Mei Lin stepped closer, not abruptly, but with quiet certainty. "I didn't ask for this," she said, her tone steady despite the vulnerability beneath it. "But it's here." Ethan felt the truth of it settle in his chest. This was not something that had arrived all at once. It had built slowly, in shared silences, in small kindnesses, in the unspoken recognition of something missing in both their lives. "I know," he said. The lantern light flickered, casting shifting shadows across their faces. The line between right and wrong, once so clear, now felt blurred by something far more difficult to define. Mei Lin's voice softened. "When you're here, it feels different, like I'm not carrying everything alone." Ethan swallowed, the weight of her words pressing against the boundaries he had tried to maintain. "You shouldn't have to carry it alone." "But I do," she replied, not with bitterness, but with quiet acceptance. "Most days I do." The storm surged, a sudden gust rattling the windows. Ethan took a step closer, drawn not by impulse, but by something deeper, something that had been building long before this night. "This isn't right," he said, though the conviction behind the words had weakened. Mei Lin held his gaze. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." Yet neither of them moved away. The silence that followed was not empty, but full of everything they had not said, everything they had tried to ignore. And in that silence, the distance between them finally disappeared. What followed was not driven by urgency, but by surrender, a quiet, inevitable crossing of a line they had both seen coming. When it was over, the storm had begun to ease, the rain softening into a steady whisper against the roof. The lantern still burned, though its light seemed dimmer now, as though aware of the shift it had witnessed. Ethan stood near the window, his back turned, the weight of what had happened settling slowly into place. Mei Lin remained still, her expression unreadable, caught between something gained and something lost. Neither spoke. There was nothing to say that would change the truth. After a long moment, Ethan reached for his coat. His movements were measured, deliberate, as though each action required careful thought. "I should go," he said quietly. Mei Lin did not stop him. At the door, he paused, his hand resting briefly against the wood. He did not turn around. Some part of him knew that if he did, leaving would become impossible. When he stepped outside, the storm had nearly passed. The air felt cooler, clearer, but offered no sense of relief. Behind him, the lantern light remained. Ahead, only darkness. And for the first time, Ethan understood that the line he had crossed could not be undone. Somewhere in the distance, thunder echoed faintly, no longer a warning, but a reminder. The night had changed them both, and morning would demand its cost. The cost of lantern light. Morning arrived without ceremony. The storm had passed, leaving the land washed and quiet, as though the night's unrest had never existed. But inside Ethan Cole, nothing had settled. The stillness he once relied on now pressed against him with unfamiliar weight, each breath carrying the memory of a line he could not uncross. He moved through his routine without purpose. The fences stood mended, the animals fed, the tools returned to their places. but the order brought no comfort. His hands knew what to do, yet his thoughts drifted elsewhere, circling a single truth he could not avoid. He had betrayed something, if not a person, then a principle he had lived by since Clara's death. And worse, he had not resisted. By midday, the weight of it had become unbearable. Ethan set aside his work and stood facing the distant edge of his land, with a faint outline of Mei Lin's home rested against the horizon. He told himself not to go. That distance was the only way to restore what little remained intact. But restraint had already failed him once. It did not hold now. At the house, the air felt different, quieter but strained, as though something unseen had settled between its walls. Lily opened the door again, her expression uncertain this time. "Mama's inside," she said softly, stepping aside. Ethan entered without speaking. Mei Lin stood near the table, her posture composed, though the stillness in her movements suggested something carefully held in place. She did not turn immediately, as if gathering herself before facing him. "You came," she said at last. Ethan nodded. "I needed to." The words felt insufficient, but they were all he had. For a moment, neither moved closer. "What happened last night?" He began, then paused, searching for language that did not exist. "It shouldn't have." Mei Lin turned then, her expression steady but not unfeeling. "No," she said quietly. "It shouldn't have." The agreement between them did not ease the tension. If anything, it sharpened it. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I won't pretend it didn't mean anything." Her gaze softened slightly. "I wouldn't believe you if you did." The honesty, simple and unguarded, only made the moment harder to bear. "But meaning something doesn't make it right," he said. Mei Lin looked down briefly, her hand resting against the edge of the table. Right and wrong stopped being simple a long time ago. Before Ethan could respond, the sound of footsteps approached from outside. Both of them turned. The door opened, and Daniel Lin stepped inside. He carried the dust of travel on his coat, his presence filling the room with a quiet authority that had been absent for too long. His eyes moved from Mei Lin to Ethan, taking in the distance between them, the tension that lingered like a trace too faint to name, yet too strong to ignore. "I wasn't expecting company," Daniel said, his tone even. Ethan straightened slightly. "I was just leaving." Daniel held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, as though measuring something unspoken. "You're the one who helped during the birth," he said. Ethan nodded. "I did what I could." A pause followed. Daniel turned to Mei Lin, his expression shifting, not to anger, but to something quieter, more difficult to face. "You could have sent word," he said. "I didn't know where you were," she replied, her voice steady. The exchange was calm, controlled, yet beneath it lay something fractured. Ethan recognized it immediately. Distance. Not the kind measured in miles, but in silence, in absence, in everything left unsaid for too long. "I'll go," Ethan said again, this time with finality. No one stopped him. The walk back felt longer than it should have. Each step carried the weight of what had been revealed, not in words, but in the spaces between them. Daniel had not accused, had not demanded answers, yet the absence of confrontation felt heavier than anger would have. Ethan reached his house as the sun began to dip, the lights stretching thin across the land. He stepped inside and closed the door, the familiar silence returning to greet him. But it was no longer the same. That night, he lit every lantern, not out of necessity, but out of something he could not fully explain. The warm glow filled the room, pushing back the shadows, yet offering no clarity. He stood in the center of it, surrounded by light, and understood for the first time that illumination did not always bring peace. Sometimes, it only revealed what could not be repaired. Days passed. Ethan did not return. The distance, this time, held, but absence did not erase what had happened. It only gave it space to settle into something permanent. One evening, as the sky dimmed into the soft shades of gray, a figure appeared at the edge of his land. Mei Lin. She approached slowly, her steps measured, as though each one required resolve. Ethan met her halfway, the fading light casting both of them in quiet shadow. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure I should," she replied. They stood facing one another, the air between them no longer uncertain, but defined by what had already been lost. "Daniel knows something has changed," she said after a moment. "He doesn't ask, but he knows." Ethan nodded. "That's worse." "Yes," she agreed. Silence settled, not uncomfortable but final. "I came to say this doesn't continue," Maylin said, her voice steady despite the weight behind it. "Not because it didn't matter, but because it did." Ethan felt the truth of her words settle deep within him. "I know," he said. She looked at him then, her expression softer, touched with something that might have been regret, or perhaps acceptance. "You brought light into my life when I needed it most." Ethan's gaze held hers, and I almost let it burn everything else. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. Maybe it already has. The honesty of it lingered between them. Then, without another word, she turned. Ethan watched as she walked away, her figure growing smaller against the fading horizon, until distance reclaimed what closeness had briefly undone. He remained where he was until the last trace of light disappeared. That night, the lanterns burned again. But this time, Ethan did not stand among them. He sat quietly, the glow surrounding him, not as a promise, but as a reminder. Some lights guide you forward. Others only show you what you've left behind. And in their steady, unchanging glow, Ethan understood that both could be true at once.